focused on electoral reform in the United States. I'm your host, Dan Sally, and with us tonight, we have Shai Robkin of Better Ballot Georgia. And how are you doing, Shai?
I am good. I'm in the center of the universe.
Where's the center of the universe?
Georgia right now, at least, is political. Yeah, that's what I mean.
You're right. Part of the interminably long 2020 election season. Now are you in Atlanta or where in Georgia are you?
I am in Sandy Springs, which is basically right outside Atlanta.
Got it.
For all intents and purposes, I'm in metropolitan Atlanta.
Yeah. Okay. Perfect. And I guess before we get into what's going on down there, could you just talk a little bit about the goal of Better Ballot Georgia?
Well, the immediate objective of Better Ballot Georgia is to somehow get ranked choice voting, or actually what we prefer to call it here right now, instant runoff voting, implemented in the state of Georgia. That may happen in a variety of different ways, but that is our immediate objective.
Yeah. And I was shocked to hear this when we talked. You all just started. You are a brand spanking new organization, right?
We're so brand spanking new that we're really not officially anything yet. So we will be filing. We will be filing for 501c3 incorporation soon as an educational organization, but we have not yet done that. In fact, only recently have we determined who our board of directors is going to be.
Okay. And so I'll ask this question, kind of dovetailing off your earlier comment. And I think this is a question that people of all political stripes laughed. Why would you try to reform elections now, Shai? It seems they're working swimmingly, aren't they?
Swimmingly, yes, indeed. Well, if Georgia's any example, we're swimming in debt in Georgia. There are lots of reasons why this is a good idea, but one of the things that has caught a lot of people's attention, particularly in Georgia, is that Georgia perhaps is the runoff capital, maybe not of the world, but of the United States, because that's what our law dictates. So we go to the polls over and over and over again. And now that's a good thing, because at least we are electing candidates that achieve a majority, unlike other places where you can win with just a plurality. But it does mean we go back to the polls, which is undemocratic in and of itself. And right now, people are really tired of it, and people are really, really repulsed by the cost. And by the way, if I can hold up something real quick right now.
Yeah, go for it.
You can see this. So what this says, if you're just listening, this says Fulton, and that's the biggest county here, which is I live in, Fulton to spend $6.5 million on historic U.S. Senate runoff. That is one county in Georgia out of 159 counties, and each county is going to bear the expense of this one runoff, and we've had multiple runoffs.
Yeah, and to bring the folks who aren't familiar with Georgia's system of elections into the conversation here too. The way it works in Georgia, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Shai, but as a candidate, you have to win at least, or you have to win a majority of the vote to take office, right? So you have to win over 50% of the vote, or to take office, and otherwise it triggers a runoff. Correct?
Exactly. It's 50% plus one.
And the other thing I want to highlight too, and this is something I actually highlighted recently when I was speaking with Rank My Vote Florida, just south of you, looking to implement the same process down there, is that you're talking now it's 6.4 million for Fulton County, correct?
6.5, but serious money.
What's 0.1 million? But the thing I always like to highlight too now is this is in the middle of COVID. This is at a time when municipalities are already cash strapped. And so the impact of these runoffs from a fiscal perspective is obviously huge.
That's one huge, thing. And if I may add, also,
go for it.
It's huge from a physical perspective, but it's also huge in this particular environment for a health perspective, because it means that both voters and poll workers have to go back to the polls, unless, of course, you are voting by mail. which of course many people do. As a matter of fact, today was the first day. We're talking here on December 14th, if I can mention that. I just did, I guess.
Yeah, of course.
Right?
Cat's out of the bag now, Shai.
Cat's out of the bag now. December 14th, which is the first day of early voting. Unfortunately, we do have early voting here, which is good because it does spread out the people who are at the polls for those people who want to go do it in person. But in this days of COVID, to get people to do something which is not necessary to do is really, I consider to be repulsive, quite frankly.
And my understanding too is that in these runoffs as well, the voter turnout the second time around is usually somewhat lower than the first, correct?
Traditionally, and I think every runoff you find anywhere, the experience is that the turnout is lower. And that's that's definitely been true in Georgia in the past, but I think it's true in just about every election in the United States, regardless of where it takes place and regardless for the office. And that's for obvious reasons. I mean, we can go into them, but that is for obvious reasons. So you're not dealing with the same set of voters the second go round as were there the first round, which is a really bit, that's a strange thing to think about when you're talking about reflecting the will of the voters.
Yep. 100%. And I want to get into the story of how you actually came upon this. But before I do that, I want to explain the concept of ranked choice voting for those who might not be familiar with it. And the analogy I use is actually from my life, Shai, which is, I have 4 kids at home. And whenever we're deciding on ordering out or going out and getting something to eat, getting all 4 of them to agree is an absolute nightmare. And so as I've begun to study alternate voting systems, I came across ranked choice voting, and I actually use it to resolve disputes around ordering food in my house. Because generally, to give you the normal setup, which is similar to our current system of elections, you have one person who wants McDonald's, one person who wants pizza, another person who wants Chinese, and then another person who wants Chipotle or something like that. And they all fight, and we never reach a resolution. Well, in the ranked choice voting environment in the Sally house, my kids each tabulate or each mark down their first, second, and third choice. We take a look, and whichever option gets the most votes out of those first, second, and third choices wins. Shai, that's an ultra simplified way of saying it, but would you agree that more or less sums up the mechanism of ranked choice voting?
Well, more or less, but I sort of lost you right at the end there when you said whoever gets the most votes wins.
Oh, excuse me. Let me rephrase that. Whichever food gets the most votes wins. So, for example, if McDonald's is somebody's first choice and then 2 people's second choice, then that automatically wins. And the majority of people are happy because, of course, the majority of people have selected McDonald's somewhere in their first or second choice.
Yeah, I think that's a little bit of a variation of the thing. But let me ask you a question real quick. How old are your kids?
Yeah, go for it.
How old are your kids?
So 10, 11, 13, and then 21. And you would think the 21-year-old would back down from the argument, but not a chance. So,
well, I was about to say, I was hoping you were going to say that they were actually all below the age of 10.
Really?
Well, the reason I say that is that ranked choice voting, if there's a rap on ranked choice voting, at least what some politicians say, is that it's just too difficult for voters to understand. But the truth is, little kids can understand the example that you gave, right? They get it. The example I like to use, if you take them into an ice cream shop and you say, well, what do you want? And your kid says, well, I want chocolate chip. And then you ask the person working behind the counter, say, oh, we're just out of it. You say, well, what is your second choice? And if they're out of that, what's your third choice? So they can rank their order of preferences. They can do that. So what I want to say here is when you're choosing your favorite restaurant that you're going to get, well, I guess these days it's a takeout, whatever it may be.
Yeah.
If you're going to rank McDonald's down to Chipotle, whatever it may be, you're going to rank them. And as you go through the ranking, the restaurant that gets the least amount of votes gets knocked out, and whoever voted for that restaurant, their votes then go to the next choice, and so on and so forth. You're always eliminating the choice that has the fewest number of votes. Now, if you'd only deal with 4, there's not too many rounds you're likely to get to, but the principle still holds.
Yeah, and you have fine-tuned my analogy and reformed elections here at the Sally household, so I appreciate that.
Yeah, I can add, one of the things people sometimes think, well, I've never heard of ranked choice voting, or I've
Yep.
never, well, and that's the term that's used most internationally, and I do mean internationally because it's been used all over the world since about 1918. But this has been used all over, not necessarily in political situations, at least for elections for public office, but people use it for all sorts of things, including deciding in a business what they want for their holiday parties, deciding in any sort of organization how they want to choose people to do certain things. People use it all the time. It's not an unfamiliar concept, but it has not really broken in big time yet, although it is breaking into the political sphere.
Mm-hmm. And now the term you're using, if I'm correct, in your organization is instant runoff voting, correct? Because that really kind of, I think, resonates more with your current system. Am I right there?
Exactly. So, we say it's instant runoff voting, also known as AKA ranked choice voting. We had to make a decision which way we're going to go. Was it going to be ranked choice voting, instant runoff voting, or vice versa? But because Georgians are so familiar with the idea of runoffs, and we want to focus on the idea of getting rid of runoffs, right, that's why we decided to call it instant runoff voting, something they could more easily identify with.
Okay. And I want to get a little bit more into your strategy and your efforts, but before we get into that, I want to talk a little bit about how you found ranked choice voting, because I found this super interesting. So by work, you're a behavioral economist, and could you just explain? Could you explain what a behavioral economist does?
Well, there's lots of things. Most behavioral economists are academicians. They do a lot of research in universities and things of that nature. And perhaps some of your listeners have heard about the most popular names, which are the Nobel Prize winners. For example, Danny Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize in economics in 2002, although he's a psychologist, or Richard Thaler, who won it in 2017, who actually is an economist at the University of Chicago. And maybe some folks have heard of Dan Ariely, who's a very, very popular and entertaining guy who has the name of the best institute in the world. It's called the Institute for Advanced Hindsight at Duke. But in any event, so I'm more interested in the practical side of behavioral economics. And I'm not an academician, so I don't do any independent research. What I do is to try to apply the principles of behavioral economics in business. So I consult with businesses on how to apply these various concepts. And I also do some teaching, primarily in continuing education classes. So that's what I do. But basically, behavioral economics, sometimes it's just referred to as a hybrid between economics and psychology. I think the easy way to understand it is it's really the study of decision making. And if I can quote Dan Ariely, who wrote probably one of the most entertaining books about behavioral economics, which is called Predictably Irrational. It's basically explaining how people make decisions, which I think people would define as being irrational, but I have to put that in quotation marks, because it may be irrational, but it may be reasonable, because we have to make very quick decisions, which they may not conform to a rational cost benefit analysis like most economists would say we should go through, but they actually are quite efficient because we just don't have the bandwidth to go through that kind of cost benefit analysis for all our decisions.
Yeah. And so it's sort of this discipline of yours. This is ultimately how you picked apart our voting system and came across instant runoff voting as a solution for Georgia.
Well, sort of. What actually brought me to that is behavioral economists very much believe in something called choice architecture, which essentially says that the way people make decisions is for the most part determined by the choice architecture that they're in, or the choice environment that they're in. And so if you change the choice environment that people find themselves in when making that decision, it can change the decisions that they make. So you can approach decision making. You could try to beat yourself to death by trying to educate people. Sometimes you can just provide them with monetary incentives. But the basic idea with behavioral economics is let's change to a great extent the environment in which, or the structure, the infrastructure in which people are making their decisions, and that will allow them to make better decisions, hopefully for themselves and hopefully for society as a whole, if you're looking at this from a societal perspective.
Hmm. Hmm. Okay, understood. And so, what's the choice architecture, would you say, around the current system of voting, and what do you think the difference is with instant runoff?
Well, it varies from where you are. I would say Georgia, as I mentioned earlier, is in a better place than a lot of places because we do have runoffs, and which ensures that at least, even though it's very imperfect, we get something that resembles a majority winner. And I guess you could say the person that wins can claim that they got a mandate. Now, I should point out that is not true. Today is the day where the Electoral College actually voted. Right? We don't pick our presidents using that system. We do pick every other office in Georgia with the exception of presidents. So presidents can be elected with a simple plurality. And that's true in the vast majority of states in the country. Right now, Maine is the only state that has adopted ranked choice voting up until now that's using it all across the board, including for presidential elections, to determine who's going to get Maine's electoral votes. Georgia is not quite there yet. So Joe Biden, who won Georgia's electoral votes, right, and won Georgia, but he won it only by 12,000. Right? He did not win, right, a majority of Georgia's voters because there was a relatively strong, right, third-party candidate that siphoned away votes from somebody. We don't know where that third-party candidate votes would have gone. Would it have gone to Trump? Would it have gone to Biden? We don't know. But Biden didn't get the 50% plus one. So now we're having these runoffs in Georgia for 2 Senate elections because in both of those cases where we happen to have this rare instance where in the same year we do have 2 Senate elections because of the retirement of a former Senator, Johnny Isakson, that in both of those cases, there was no candidate that achieved that 50% plus one. So therefore, we go to a runoff. But in most places, it's what they call pass the post, meaning you just get a plurality. So you can be elected with, you can be elected with 25% of the vote as long as there's a bunch of other candidates who got less than 25% of the vote. And I don't think anybody who gets a quarter of the votes can claim that the majority wanted them. In fact, it's definitely the case that the majority did not want that particular candidate. They voted for somebody else.
Yep. It's effectively winning for one more vote than second place is what dictates a winner today. It's interesting too, and I don't want to get too off topic here. It's interesting that you bring up that Joe Biden didn't win a majority. I think because for most of us watching from the outside, the numbers we were seeing were 50 point some odd percent. I don't even think that third party candidate entered into the calculations I saw on at least on most national media.
Yeah, well, if you were comparing him to Trump, that was the case. But there was the libertarian candidate who siphoned away a small percentage, but that was sufficient.
Yeah.
We're talking about 12,000 votes out of 5 million, so it didn't take much.
Yeah. Oh, 100%. And, the other thing I always highlight, and I think the people who watch religiously are probably sick of me talking about it, but, Massachusetts District 4 decided their congressional representative in the Democratic primary, which is just common up here. It's a very blue state. And the person who's representing District 4 won 24% of the vote in the Democratic primary. So effectively 24% of those who voted in the primary decided who was going to represent the entire district. And I think that that's another example of kind of the flaw of this system. And
let me just jump in there.
Because, go on, please.
I think that ranked choice voting is particularly important when you're dealing with primaries because there very often you have so many candidates. I mean, think back earlier this year, back in January, how many candidates were there in the Democratic field? 20, whatever number. It was 20 something. I forget the exact number now. It was 20 something. So with the folks who went to the polls early, their states early, they basically were trying to choose between 20 candidates, and God knows, how do you try to figure out that? How are you going to get to a majority situation? The answer is you don't. So, and if you're in a situation which many states are, where it's a winner take all, then you get a really perverse result. At least if it's broken up proportionally, which it is in some cases, it's a better situation. But lots of states, like Georgia, you have a primary, it's winner take all, regardless of what that winner takes it with.
Yep. 100%. So you do have instances where, especially in the very beginning primaries, the Republican primary back in 2016, I think started out with 10 candidates. And you have a situation where the winning candidate is maybe getting 10, 12% of the vote total. And so I guess, getting into how this applies to Georgia, then you already have the runoff system. So in a way, you're already ensuring a plurality. How do you view, or majority, excuse me. Sorry. Thank you. You're the economist here. So so you're already ensuring a majority. So how do you feel, how would instant runoff differ from the current system of runoffs, and how would it be an improvement to what you're currently doing?
Well, first and foremost, we're not going to have another election. It's all going to happen in that single general election. So on November 3rd, right, when people went to the polls, then let's just take the example of the Senate runoff that was what they called the regular election, as opposed to the exceptional one, or the regular election was between David Perdue, John Ossoff, and there was a pretty strong third-party candidate whose last name is Hazel, running for the Libertarians. So essentially, in that election, right, you would go to the polls, and as opposed to just voting for just one, you would vote for your first choice, and then you would indicate who your second choice was. Now, let's assume, but we don't know it for a fact, that the Libertarian Hazel was the third party. Now, he was the third party, but he was the third choice. I mean, he was not among the top two choices of either of the voters. Well, then each voter's ballot would be looked at again and said, all right, you voted for the Libertarian Hazel first. He gets knocked out. Who was your second choice? Right? His second choice, if it was for Perdue, the Republican, that's where his vote would have gone. If it was Ossoff, the Democrat, that's where his vote would have gone. And those people who voted on November 3rd, we would have then had a majority. Done deal. Now, we should point out, in fairness, right, in the interest of intellectual honesty, no one is forced to choose beyond their first choice. So if those people that voted for that third party candidate did not want to indicate their second choice, because it's for them, let's say in this case, it was a Libertarian, it was Libertarian or bust. Right? I'm not going to even, I don't care. And a lot of people may claim that if you voted Libertarian, you really didn't care who's going to win anyway, because you knew your vote was going to be wasted, which is a big problem in and of itself. But it could be they'd say, look, I'm not going to give a second choice. But we do know from experience, once you're in your voting, people will indicate who their second choice is. But at least you're going to get a majority of those people who voted, and you're going to get a much larger number of people who voted as opposed to having to come back to the polls 6 weeks later, which is what we're doing. Right? Or 2 months later. It has to be at least 6 weeks in Georgia, right, to vote again.
Yeah. Well, and look, here's the other thing. This has been, I think, a very long and sometimes exhausting election season, and a very long and exhausting year. And I mean, you've got a better sense of the mood down in Georgia, but I've got to imagine there are some people who are just tuning this out now.
Well,
am I wrong?
I think that it'll be incredibly interesting to see what the turnout is going to be. Today is our first day that we have any kind of clue, because it's the first day of early voting, but we have no idea how many people voted by mail. I voted by mail. Well, actually, I didn't mail my ballot in. We have drop boxes, which is a good thing. It just so happens that I actually took my ballot to the drop box today. So I dropped it in today. So that was done. So people do believe that the turnout for this runoff will be greater than it has been in the past, because look, we're the only game in town. And of course, if you've heard
Mhm.
there are hundreds of millions of dollars. The big winners, of course, on this runoff are the TV stations. They
Mhm.
are raking it in, right? And what you see when you watch anything is one political ad after the next. Do any of them
Mhm.
make any difference? That I couldn't tell you. But a lot of
Mm.
people, when you say tuning off or tuning out, that they're certainly tired of.
Yeah. 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 And I think that, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but yeah, I've got to imagine that that has some negative impact ultimately on turnout in and of itself. Just people get sick of hearing it. One thing we talked about too before we hit chord that I found really interesting, sort of the how I guess primaries can be reformed using instant runoff, because we were talking a little bit about the final four and the final five system of determining elections. Is that something you're looking at a better ballot, or no?
Maybe down the road,
Okay.
we will. Right. Look,
Mm-hmm.
let's put it this way. We're advocating for instant runoff voting, AKA ranked choice voting in Georgia. Now, the truth is that it's going to have to be every individual party, right? It's going to have to be the Republicans and the Democrats and any other party that's going to have to make their own decision how to conduct their election. So for this past year, there were 5 states that conducted their Democratic primaries using ranked choice voting. I'm
Mm-hmm.
sure there will be more in 4 years from now. And I would hope that the Republicans will also adopt this system. And I think the Republicans, to a great extent, after what happened in 2016, because one thing we do know is that Donald Trump got the Republican nomination without getting a majority mandate from the Republicans who voted in their primaries. More people voted for other candidates than did Donald Trump. That is the
Mm-hmm.
case. Now,
Mm-hmm.
how would he have fared in a ranked choice voting? Well, that's conjecture. Who knows? But at
Mm-hmm.
least we would know. At least we would
Mm-hmm.
know.
Mm-hmm. And I think you could argue too to keep it even as well. When you look at some of the gripes on the Democrat side as well, obviously they're not always 100% happy with the way with their system of nominating presidential candidates. And so I think it's a very bipartisan grievance, I think. Now,
Let me just mention that because I'm
go on,
glad you
please. Yeah.
mentioned that part of it. You said, one of the first questions you asked me is, why are we doing this now? Well, we're doing
Mm-hmm.
this now because Georgians are so attuned right now to having to go back to the polls. But
Mm-hmm.
the raison d'etre for this is not for right now. And for a great extent, it's really not the cost. The cost is something that we're focused on a lot, but there's so
Mm-hmm.
many other reasons, and we've already touched upon them, about better voters' choices and better democracy. And I would also say just better working government in so many different ways.
Mm-hmm.
But the truth is, if you look at this past Democratic primary, there were, if I get this right, about 6 million votes that were wasted. And I use that term wasted, but these are people who voted early, but by the
Mm-hmm.
time their official election date came, their candidate they voted for had already dropped out of the race. Because if you remember, after the vote in South Carolina, where Joe Biden emerged as the front runner,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of people had already voted for Super Tuesday primaries. Well, you had right after that, you had all these candidates who dropped out. Well, their votes with ranked choice voting could have gone somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Bernie Sanders
Mm-hmm.
was still in the race. Michael Bloomberg was still in the race. They could have gone
Mm-hmm.
somewhere else,
Yeah.
but they
Yeah.
basically went nowhere.
And I got to say too, I don't think you can understate the impact that's going to have on voter enthusiasm as well. Because if you have 2 candidates that emerge that even the party faithful don't necessarily feel 100% vested in, that's not a system that's going to produce the most compelling candidates, and it's not a system that's going to produce, I think, the candidates that resonate the most with the largest majority of voters.
Without question. I think if there's a mantra for the ranked choice voting movement, is that the system that we have today, for the most part, requires us just to vote for the lesser of two evils for many people, not for everybody, but for many people.
Yep.
Now, I like to say, I like things that rhyme. So with ranked choice voting, you can vote for your first without fear of the worst.
There you go. See, here I am using this ham-fisted analogy about ordering my kids dinner, and then you come up and just Dr. Seuss it, and it's just elegant and it's perfect. So thank you, Shai. I may steal it if you don't mind, but I will credit you for it. I promise.
I'll give you another rhyme. Okay.
Rhyme away.
Well, the other rhyme, this is my, I don't know if I've ever been compared to Dr. Seuss, but I would take that as a compliment. My other one is vote for whoever speaks for me with no thought at all about strategy. In other words, we very often have to go to the polls and try to figure out, think about those Democrats who had to figure out where would their vote best be used. It wasn't who they wanted the most. They had to say, well, God, I don't want to waste my vote. With ranked choice voting, you don't have to think about it. You vote for whoever you want, and then you go down the list, choosing your second, third, fourth, whatever number it is. And therefore, you don't have to waste time and mental energy strategizing.
And I think there was a lot of soul searching in the very beginning of that primary too on electability, and who was going to resonate the most with middle America, who was going to energize the base the most. And I think, to your point, those calculations wouldn't have to be made, number one. Number two, I think any winning candidate that emerges can clearly see whose platform was the second, third, and fourth most popular is going to have a much easier time deciding how they might amend their platform to better fit the desires of their own party as a result.
Well, absolutely. But it's not just that the candidates, the winning candidate is going to see where those came from. That winning candidate is going to have his or her finger on the pulse of all the voters, or at least a majority of the voters, to say, what does the majority want? You can't win by appealing to your base only. So what it means is you build broader coalitions. And that's, in my opinion, a good thing.
Yep. And, especially kind of bringing it back to Georgia here, Georgia it's a purple state. I mean, it's historically voted Republican, but it's becoming, I think, more and more split down the middle. And correct me if I'm wrong there, Shai.
Well, clearly this election and our governor's election in 2018, which was very close, won by the Republican, but very, very close, indicates that Georgia, perhaps one can say, is a purple state. It's certainly a toss-up state without question right now.
And I think that kind of get to the point you brought up about strategy, the point you brought up about calculation. I think a lot of times and again, I'll dip into your knowledge of choice architecture again here, but I think a lot of times if you look at the calculation of a candidate, the candidate has to decide, how am I going to fire up my base and compromise just enough to pull over those people in the middle. And I'd imagine in an instant runoff system, I can really focus maybe more on where the bulk of the votes are. Am I incorrect there or no?
Well, you're going to have to cobble together 50% plus one. That's you're going to have to do. You're not going to win. Like I say, in Georgia, you can't win with a plurality. That is true. But you're going to have to appeal right from the beginning to a broader base of the electorate, right from the beginning. And you got to be really careful about who you piss off. You start attacking other candidates who say, look, you know what? You may not vote for me first, but I need you to vote for me second. And by the way, I should also point out one of the benefits there. It's a two-way street here. So the candidates have to pay more attention to more voters, but it also, in place they have, the voters have to pay more attention to more candidates, because in the system we have today, you decide, all right, I like this candidate. And quite after that, you don't even think about the other ones. Do you bother to consider what the other ones stand for, what their issues that are important to them? With this, well, if you're thinking to yourself that your first choice is not going to emerge as the majority winner, then you have to say, or worst situation, that your first choice ends up being at the bottom of the pile and gets knocked out first. And therefore, your vote has to go to somebody else. You have to say, well, who do I want it to go for? So you look at more candidates, you consider more issues, and that's a good thing too. It leads to a more energized and educated electorate.
Absolutely. And I think the term that you used when we were talking last that I really liked is you're not as focused on, what jersey the person's wearing. You're not as focused on the political brand in so much as you're really focused on the substance of what they're going to do in office. One question I had for you is, most of the people I've spoken with and most of the ranked choice voting, instant runoff voting initiatives I've seen have been in states with ballot initiatives, states where the voters can circumvent the state legislature to get something like this implemented. You can't do that in Georgia, though, correct?
We cannot do that. We're a legislative state.
Got it. And so what's the strategy for pushing that forward and getting sort of the buy-in of the legislature to enact this?
Well, it'd be great to think that the legislatures or the legislators are going to enact legislation simply because it's the right thing to do for democracy. Okay, that would be a wonderful thing. To some extent, there are those. Don't get me wrong. There are some legislators who actually do believe that we need to do the right thing to best reflect the will of the voters, regardless of how those votes turn out. And if Georgia's a purple state on a statewide level, maybe this year was, somewhat Democrat, but somewhat Republicans. The Republicans did pretty darn well down ballot. Now, but basically, yes, we're going to have legislators who decide they want to pass this legislation, but they need to hear from the folks out there, the grassroots, from the populace, to say, look, we want that. And that's our job at Better Ballot Georgia. Our job at Better Ballot Georgia is to energize the grassroots, the people, to tell their representatives, you need to do this to better reflect the will of the voters in Georgia. That's our goal, is to get them to communicate that. To do that, first of all, we have to educate people, because we can't assume that most people understand what this is about. It's a relatively new concept. So that's a big part of what we have to do. Now, the Georgia legislature will start meeting in January. They only meet for a very short, like 40-day session each year. That's how they work in Georgia. And it could be that there will be some instant runoff voting legislation that will be introduced. It's not clear what the nature of that legislation may be. There's a couple of possibilities which I can talk about, not clear. But if some legislation is introduced, and right now the folks who are thinking about that are trying to keep their cards very, very close to the chest, if that's the right term, not quite sure. But in any event, that based on what legislation is introduced may actually determine how we go about our education efforts.
And from what I've heard from other folks who push this forward, it really is voter education. That's the number one thing, because kind of getting back to something you said at the beginning of this episode, the biggest challenge or the biggest pushback you get is that it's too confusing. And from what I've heard time and time again is when voters have this explained to them, it makes all the difference. And the buy-in is almost instantaneous. Do you feel too, in the current climate, and if you want to pass on this question, that's fine. But everything I hear from Georgia at this point in time revolves around the result of the presidential election, the recounts, how that's playing into the Senate runoff, how the Secretary of State, the Republican Secretary of State, has to defend himself against his own party. And there's just a lot of there's definitely a lot of there's a lot of heat around this issue. do you feel like, in a way, from the standpoint of getting buy-in from the folks in office, this might be the best time, just given the state of affairs down there?
All right. Well, it may be the best time. Look, you know what? We are, at least based on the presidential election, although, Trump is an anomaly. So maybe we're still redder than some people would like us to be. But regardless, that the legislature in Georgia remains solidly red. It's solidly Republican. So this is not going to pass without Republicans being on board. Now, that I would hope that the Democrats, now there are a lot of Democrats who were just delighted, for example, that Jon Ossoff has the opportunity to run in a runoff against David Perdue, because I think one can say with a great degree of assurance that in a ranked choice voting system, that David Perdue would have won outright, because he was I think, at 49.8%. I mean, he was really darn close. Ossoff got 46 point something. And then we had this libertarian, right, who siphoned off the majority of the third party votes. Now, it wouldn't, I don't know which way the libertarians would have voted in this particular case. A lot of people want to make certain assumptions. I don't do that, but it would have only taken a very small percentage of those libertarian votes to have gone, their second choice, to have gone for Perdue, to have pushed him over the top. Now, Democrats are delighted in that case that ranked choice voting did not apply. Okay. All right. So be it. I would hope the Democrats would be willing to overlook this particular individual circumstance to look at the bigger picture of why this is a good thing. And by the way, there are some folks who would say if Georgia had conducted its presidential election using ranked choice voting, that perhaps, I think it's less certain by definitely, because in this case, Biden did have a lead, as opposed to Perdue who had a much bigger lead over Ossoff than Biden has over Trump. Some would like to argue, well, perhaps the votes for the third party candidates, primarily libertarian, would have gone to Trump and Trump would have won. That's really speculative. I don't know. But there are people, look, if the Republicans believe it, here's my point. If they believe it, okay, that's fine. If that motivates them to pass instant runoff voting, ranked choice voting, that's fine. You know what? It's not the reason I want them to support it, but if that's what it takes, let's go for it, which is one of the reasons that the iron is hot here that we want to strike with.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And the thing I would say too, is that there isn't, I think one of the big challenges, you have a lot of independents, obviously, who are very eager to have the system changed, the system of running elections changed, and on the partisan stand, on the standpoint of people who maybe are a little more partisan, they tend to have a little more suspicion. And I think, again, anything that helps kind of get them over the hump and get their buy-in is great. So, last question for you: if I'm listening to this, or I'm watching this right now, and I'm in Georgia, and I want to get involved, how do I find you?
Well, the best way to find it, unfortunately, we're so new, we don't even have a website. So you're nobody without a website. We will have one soon. But the way you can find us and communicate, we do have a Facebook page. And you can find us, it's Better Ballot Georgia on Facebook. So you can find us on Facebook right now. That's the best way to find us.
And they are very responsive folks. I can attest to that. That is why we're sitting here. Well,
good.
Shai, thank you for spending your Monday evening with me. I appreciated the insight. I appreciated the rhymes. I've been sitting here, and my kids have been having a raucous game of Madden on PlayStation right below me. So I'm hoping none of that showed up in the audio. I'd love to have you. You didn't hear a thing? Okay, good. Well, then I'm hoping that goes for the audience too. And again, thank you so much for your time. This was great.
It was a pleasure.